Morning. Um, Nathan Hargraves here. I just wanted to come back again and record my thoughts and maybe share those thoughts with people maybe that would be interested in hearing what I have to say. To my knowledge, I don't have any subscribers on YouTube. So maybe that's a fault of mine. Maybe my content or my opinions aren't very popular. Or maybe I'm not doing a very good job of getting my videos out there, which is not really my intention anyway. So I'm an unsubscribed content maker, I guess. I don't know. But I wanted to just briefly share my thoughts this morning. Not necessarily about the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk. That was a tragedy, and I actually watched one of the videos of the actual shooting, and it was very disturbing. I kind of wish I hadn't watched it, because once you watch something like that, you can't unwatch it. And the brutality of the murder was any person with any kind of conscience would be unnerved, I think, by watching such a heinous act. But it's the world we live in right now, and I hope that his legacy endures. I didn't agree with everything that Charlie Kirk said, especially politically. I consider myself a traditional Southern conservative, and so there were a number of things where I did not see eye to eye with Charlie Kirk. Because as some of you may know, most of you may not, conservatism is not the ideals that are primarily espoused by the modern day Republican Party. There really is no conservative political party in this country, contrary to popular belief. So that is something that I'm not going to go into at all, but I just wanted to make that comment first. That I didn't agree with Charlie Kirk on everything, but bless his heart and his family. I pray that God would comfort them in this time of mourning. With that being said, I was having a conversation with my mother, as is my wont, and we were talking about the state of this country and how it's just so polarized. So polarized. It's probably more polarized today than it has been since 1861, which was the beginning of the Civil War, as it is called. I don't really call it the Civil War. I call it the war between the states, because I don't believe it was a civil war, but that discussion is for another time. But we live in such a polarized world right now in this country. And, I've heard calls for what has become to be known as a national divorce or a balkanization of our country as a remedy to this polarization, because as a society we have large groups of people that are so different in their worldview. You have conservatives like myself, and a lot of the country is conservative to some degree or another. And then you have large portions of the population that are more liberal, and I distinguish liberalism from leftism, but just liberal. They're more liberal, whether they're more liberal on a social perspective or they're more liberal as it regards the role of government. But I would argue that from a political party position, Both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are statists. They believe in a very strong, centralized national government. I heard it said once that the Republicans believe that tax dollars should be spent on military, and the Democrats believe that tax dollars should be spent on social services. But both parties believe they have an unadulterated right to your money, in that they get to tell you how much of your money you get to keep. Well, that at its very fundamental core is a reflection of what they believe the role of government actually is, which is a master of the people. And as a conservative, as a Southern conservative, really, I couldn't disagree with that position more. Now, there are voices across the political spectrum that are saying that we have a problem here. And as I mentioned, there are now calls again being revived after the Charlie Kirk assassination for what is known as a national divorce. And for a while, I really believed that that was probably the only good option for our dilemma. But as I was thinking about it this morning, driving into work and having a conversation with my mother about it, I kind of realized that there is one option that is not national divorce that we could do. Now, how likely it is that this would happen is yet to be seen. But it certainly is an option that we could do that would protect minorities and empower people. Because that's really what we're talking about. On the left side, you have siren calls of democracy this, we're a democracy even though we're not a democracy, or at least rather our nation wasn't founded as a democracy. I would argue that it probably is more of a democracy now, a national democracy, than when it was originally founded. But in my opinion, the answer to a lot of our woes, and the answer to how we put a voice and power back into the hands of the people, and that most vulnerable minority, which is the individual, is to restore the original intent of a federal republic in our country. While the founders were not perfect, they certainly were not perfect morally. Slavery was an issue at the founding. And, as most people know, it was a worldwide phenomenon that everybody participated in, okay? Black, white, yellow, red, everybody participated in slavery for thousands of years. And certainly our forefathers, namely those gentlemen that, came over from Northern Europe and established colonies here in this land, they participated, a lot of them did, in this institution. But with that being set aside, while they weren't perfect, they gave us something that was unique in the history of men. A form of government that was predicated on the idea that people have unalienable rights. And they knew the dangers of heavy-handed government. They knew the dangers of pure democracy. And so they fashioned a government in the best of their ability that was unique, namely a federal republic. And the genius behind what they did, as is laid out in the Constitution was not perfect. I personally believe that it gave too much authority to the federal government. But with that being said, it still, in its original intent, intended to limit the scope and power of the federal government and place the bulk, by far the majority of the power and authority, in the hands of the people, and secondarily in the hands of the states, which was the essentially the agent of the people that lived in those states. And then the federal government was formed by those states as an agent of the states. Now the question is well, how can reverting back to a pure federal republic help us? Well, it gives a louder voice to the people. That is the biggest benefit. Right now, and I made this argument to my mom, most people don't have a clue what is going on from a political standpoint within their own states. Most people go to the polls, if they vote at all, they go when there's a national election, most people, and during those national elections, there will be state elections and city elections as well, and normally these people are just casting a vote for the party that they tend to vote for. They don't have a clue about municipal politics. They don't have a clue about state politics. All they care about is the national stage. We have emphasized the federal, or what I call the national government, preferentially to state and local elections. And what it has done is it has taken power and the voice away from the people in any particular locale. Originally, the way the Constitution was designed and the way our government was set up was that most of the political business was done at the local level. And me as an individual citizen, or my neighbor as an individual citizen, could go and involve themselves in the busiest part of the political spectrum, or I should say the political stage, not spectrum. And the voice of the people in any local area, that voice would then be heard on the state area. So I currently live in Louisiana, and so I would be more concerned about who is representing me in the state legislature more than I would be concerned about who was representing me in the federal legislature, because most of the decisions were made at the local level and at the state level. Now, again, the genius of the founders, they set up the legislative and the executive and the judicial branches of the federal government in such a way that the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., those members of Congress were elected by districts. So me as an individual citizen does have a say in who represents me within a small group. And I think originally James Madison said that that the proper ratio of U.S. House representative to citizen would be like one representative out of maybe, I don't know, maybe it's 30,000. It may be less than that. I can't remember. But now it's like one for every 70,000. And the argument could be made that that is hardly representative government. I mean, 70,000 people for one representative, that's crazy. But originally the way it was set up, because our country was much smaller in population, which is ideal for a republic, is that we had a very small ratio of citizens to representatives in the U.S. House. So the people of the district in any given state elected their representative in the House. Originally, the way the Senate was made up, the state legislatures of any given state appointed the senators, so that those senators, and every state had 2 senators, it didn't matter how many people lived in that state. Every state was equal. And those senators represented the interests of the states, not of the people in the states directly, But of the states, the House of Representatives represented the people's interests directly, district-wise. But the Senate and the senators that sat in the Senate were supposed to represent their given state and what benefited the state. And then, of course, the president was elected by the Electoral College. So you had, and a popular vote. So you had both the popular vote and the Electoral College vote, and those kind of work in conjunction with one another. And sometimes you can have a president that's elected by both popular and Electoral College, and sometimes you can't. But the point of that was to maintain small government on the federal level and strong government in the states and in the people. And then, of course, the judiciary, the Supreme Court and all that is appointed by the president and the cabinet, but the Senate has to confirm. And the Senate represents the states. Now, since the passage of the 17th Amendment, now the senators are elected popularly from a popular vote by the people in the state. So the senators no longer represent the state as any kind of important entity. The states are really just a custom almost. They're just a tradition that we hold on to in name, but they don't really have any power in what goes on in the federal government. And that's by design. The whole point of the passage of the 17th Amendment, in my opinion, was to remove power from the states and transfer that power into the central government of Washington, D.C. And so what happens is that the people and the minorities actually lose their voice because of the passage of the 17th Amendment. Not only that, it encourages career politicians. So it seems to me, with all that being said, and that may have been a little bit of a rant, that the answer, or a possible answer, to our polarization in this country is to empower the individual. Now, it could also be said that we need to take power away from Leviathan, which I am referencing the national government in Washington, D.C. The founders never envisioned the juggernaut that we have today. And say what you will about the founding fathers, and whether or not they were racist or not, that's neither here nor there. We have to put power back in the hands of the people. And in order to do that, we have to remove power from the federal government, or the national government. I keep calling it a federal government. It's not a federal government anymore. We haven't had a federal government since the late 19th century. The only remaining maybe symbol of federalism in this country is the Electoral College. And now there are people calling for its, removal from our political process. But the whole point of the Electoral College was to give power to the states. No harm, no wrong could be done by citizens being more involved in their local and state politics. We must put an emphasis back on the municipal and the state political world. I should be concerned about what's happening in Louisiana as a Louisiana resident. Citizens of California should be concerned about what's happening in California. We should not be busied or worried about what our national government is doing so much. I mean, really, in the grand scheme of things, when you look at the Constitution, there are like 6 or 7 delegated authorities. And the 10th Amendment is clear that any authority that is not specifically spelled out in the Constitution and delegated to the federal government, it belongs to the people, the states, and the people that live within them. In my estimate, this is the best answer short of a national divorce. We are a huge country, way bigger than the founders ever imagined. And I think an argument can be made to the fact that the founders anticipated that as the country grew, that this continent would be comprised of multiple republics, not this massive country that we have today. We don't want to put ourselves in a vulnerable position internationally. So there is still value of having this federal government that can speak for the states on an international scale. But we need to curtail the power of the federal government. They have gotten us into such a mess. We need to think locally and act locally. We need to empower our state legislatures, our governors. I mean, consider this. That California, if it was to be its own country, would be in the top 40 countries of the world as far as population. I mean, their economy alone puts them up there in the top of the list. Each state could be its own country if it wanted to be. I mean, really. I mean, there are some states that are poorer than others, or that have smaller populations than others, but we just don't need this massive national government. And by putting power back into the hands of the states, and by putting power back into the hands of the peoples of those states, we will empower those people to write their own destiny. Now, how does this answer polarization? Well, if I live in the state of Louisiana, which I do, and I find that it is the people of the state are endorsing policies, the majority of the people that I don't agree with, then while it may prove some difficulty in me relocating to another state, I still have that option. People relocate from one state to another all the time. I'm a perfect example. In the last 10 years, I have lived in 3 different states. We left the Chattanooga area in 2015, moved to Kentucky. Then I moved to Ohio, and now I live in Louisiana. And all that was because of my job. States could compete for citizens and for business the way that the United States competes internationally for business. States could do that. They could do that through their tax laws. They could do that through their tariffs, through them making appeals to businesses to come and set up shop, to get employees based on, I mean, you know, like Florida right now is talking about doing away with property taxes. Can you imagine if Florida could actually do that? People would want to move to Florida, I mean, quickly. I mean, if I knew that I could go and buy a piece of property and build a house in Florida and not have to pay property taxes, or if I could go and build a business and not have to pay property taxes, let alone income taxes, which I don't think they have. Now, they may have higher sales taxes, but I can avoid those sales taxes by finding the best deal. There's so many benefits to putting power back into the hands of the states. And from a polarization standpoint, those people that tend to lean more liberal as far as their opinions and beliefs can move to more liberal states. And those people that prefer more conservative positions can move to more conservative states. The benefit to what I'm proposing is that regardless of which state you live in, if all the states and the people could get on board, the liberal would have a voice and power in the liberal state. And the conservative would have a voice and power in the conservative state. And then those states could vie for, policy on the global level in the federal government. Now, I've heard it said that if in fact we did repeal the 17th Amendment, which is what I'm arguing for as the first step, that essentially the Senate would be filibuster proof, because right now a majority of states, in a supermajority of the states in the country, have Republican legislatures, which assume that maybe they are, conservative, which I argue that that's not necessarily a given. But here's the thing is, let's say, for example, that you did have that. Okay, let's say that we repealed the 17th Amendment and that a supermajority of state legislatures were Republican, and which would mean that the federal Senate would be ruled or would be run by Republicans. Why would that be okay for liberal states like California? Well, because most of everything that happens in California is decided in California. That's the beauty. California is the maker of their own destiny. They're not relying on the federal government to give them aid programs and to give them this and to give them that so that they can live out their lives the way they want to. The federal government's scope is small as it relates to the country. It only has, its main scope is how it represents the states on an international scale. And so California should not have to concern itself with what Nebraska or with what Texas or with what Maine is doing, because all the power, for the most part, is in the hands of the California legislature and its people. And so liberals in California will say, hey, we're a liberal state, primarily, and they are, even though there's a lot of conservatives that live in California. I would do a lot of work out there, and I've been surprised by how many Trump signs, again, conservatives, I don't know if they're really conservatives, but Republicans, let's say that, how many Trump signs were in California during the election. But it just so happens that the cities there are so massively populated that they swing the entire state. But that's okay. And if those quote-unquote conservatives that live in California don't like it, they can move to a conservative state. And if they can't move to a conservative state because they can't afford it, well, then the onus is on them to campaign and to do grassroots work in their state in order to kind of shift the culture in California. California should be what California is. And me, as a conservative living in a conservative state, I don't have to worry about my tax dollars going to fund California, because the federal government's scope is small as it relates to the states. And I know that my tax dollars, if in fact I have to pay taxes in the state of Louisiana, will go to Louisiana. The genius of the founders was unparalleled. So we don't have to have a national divorce. We just have to get back to the original intent of how this government was set up. Now, no one can argue that from the very beginning, there was a disintegration of this original design. I mean, Alexander Hamilton, I know he's probably not as bad as what some people make out, but I mean, the man wrote one thing in the Federalist Papers and then turned around and advocated for things like a central bank, high protectionist tariffs, things like this. And this philosophy got carried on by Henry Clay and on into Abraham Lincoln. And now Abraham Lincoln was essentially the father of this new national government. He was a Republican, by the way, and a progressive. The Progressive Party the progressiveness of politics today has its roots in Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party. Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican. as far as I understand it. Now, I may be wrong, but that's how I understand it. So, anyway, if we want to fix the polarization, then we have to let people choose for themselves in their states how they want to live. And if the majority of people in California, and California has a Republican, lowercase r, Republican form of government. They have an executive branch, they have a Senate and House, and they have a court. So the same type of federal republic that we have that we're supposed to have on a grand scale is guaranteed to each state. And they can be involved in their state politics and in their local politics. And I can be involved in my state and local politics. And I don't have to worry about my tax dollars being siphoned to pay for projects in Idaho or in Massachusetts. Another thing that should be considered is that we need to rethink our monetary policy in this country. The Federal Reserve Bank is the main tool of the national government to rob from the people. There's no question about that. Inflation is a hidden tax. And this inflation that is constantly being perpetuated by the government at the hands of the Federal Reserve is a tool in order to rob the people of their money and redistribute it into the hands of well-connected, moneyed interests. There's no question about that. This is one of the reasons why, as a Southern conservative, I'm against finance capitalism. Now, I know there's all kinds of people on the right that would say, oh, capitalism is free markets, you're just a socialist. No, I'm not a socialist, and I would argue that capitalism, as it has been practiced, forget theory, okay, in this regard. Because all the theories in the world don't matter if it's never been practiced this way. Capitalism, in our American experience, has always been an economy of regulated markets at the behest and benefit of special interests. That's the way it is. You can have free markets without capitalism as it has been practiced. Now, if we want to talk about capitalism in some theorized idea, that's fine. But you have to tell me how we ensure that capitalism is practiced that way. And in my argument, the way that capitalism is practiced that way is by reverting back to federalism, putting the power back into the hands of the states, making sound money a goal worth striving for that limits the power of the government, whether it be federal government or state government or local government, from inflating currency and thereby stealing purchasing power from the people. So these are just things that I've been thinking about, and I really do believe that one of the first steps that could happen to get us down this road is to repeal the 17th Amendment. Now, some people may hear that and say, oh, there's all kinds of problems with that. Well, look, we got all kinds of problems right now. And there's not one solution that I've heard from a career politician in Washington, D.C. that has even come close to addressing this problem. We can't do a national divorce because of the vulnerability that it would put us in. And let's make no mistake, it would be devastating. It could possibly lead to conflict. It's just not the best way. The best way is to go back to what we were originally given. John Adams is famously quoted as saying that the type of government that they gave us was suited wholly for a moral and religious people, and that it was an unfit type of government for people that were not that. George Washington said that the more immoral a people become, the more they have need of masters to rule over them. Benjamin Franklin, when asked what kind of government that the people were given, he said, a republic if you can keep it. The pursuit of virtue, doing the right thing, and the fact that we were given a federal republic work hand in hand. If the liberal states in this country want programs to help the poor, they want, to defund the police, they want a more equitable society as they see it, then they can do those things within their states. And if lawsuits get brought because of things happening in the states, and let's say, for example, California wants to do something, and let's say a group of people sue the state of California for doing it, and it goes all the way up to the California Supreme Court. And let's say they lose that battle in the Supreme Court, because you can assume that the California Supreme Court will be seated by liberal justices. Let's say that Supreme Court rules in favor of the state, and then that plaintiff takes it all the way to the Supreme Court. Well, let's say that the federal Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. is seated by more conservative justices, and they rule on the part of the plaintiff. Well, then the state of California has a choice to make. If this is a voluntary union of states, and the state of California doesn't like the fact that the federal Supreme Court is dictating to them how they handle business within their state, and if this federal government that I'm talking about does very little for California in the form of subsidies and all of that, well, then California can just leave the union and form their own country. They already have the infrastructure set up to be a republic. Their economy is certainly big enough to support themselves. If they get their house in order and they're not dependent on inflationary spending by the federal or national government of Washington, D.C., then they can certainly do that. That's the beauty of our system. If California finds that they are so far removed from, say, the other states, from a position of policy, questions of morality, according to our Declaration of Independence, they have a right, by God, to break the bonds that were formerly holding them together with the United States. And the rest of the states should let them go. Because we're not about coercion. And it should also be mentioned that if the northern part of California, that may be more conservative than the southern part, or let's say the western part is more liberal than the eastern part of California, and the eastern part of California wants to secede from Western California and form their own state, they are within their God-given right to do that. And then if that eastern part of California wants to come back into the union, it can. It's all about freedom and the ability to determine one's own destiny based on the convictions that that person or that group of people have. It's real simple. So, these are my thoughts. I know that some people may see this video and think this man is a madman. That may be true. But in my estimate, this is the best answer that we have available to us to deal with this polarization and this extreme differences of opinions, of questions of morality and worldview. This is it. And we need to seriously consider this. And the first step that I'm advocating for is the repeal of the 17th Amendment. Hope you guys all have a great day. God bless.